everyone? Welcome back to the Jay's Fifth Down podcast. I'm your host, Jay, and here today with Aaron Freeman, host of the Locked On Falcons podcast. Aaron, thanks for coming on here to talk some Falcons football and just to recap their interesting season, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, very interesting. But before we get into that, man, make sure you guys check us out here on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Of course, check Aaron's podcast out, Locked On Falcons, wherever you get your favorite podcasts as well. They're also on YouTube, so give them a subscribe and check them out. So, Aaron, Falcons finished the year 7-10, and once again missed the playoffs. Quarterback play wasn't the best this year. That ran Mariota, so just can you kind of just give us a recap of how the year went, and did you expect it to go like this, or maybe it was a little bit different than what you expected? What did you think of this season for the Falcons?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was kind of par for my expectations. There was a couple of games in there, sprinkled in there, that sort of surprised me a little bit. But I figured they would probably have a losing season, and it was just a question of sort of. I know I did a couple of polls before the season to sort of see where other people were at on sort of their win-loss record. And I kind of went into the season expecting like a 5-12 record. And obviously they exceeded those expectations. But I think doing a couple of polls, it seemed like about like 80% of the fan base was kind of like somewhere between like 4 and 7 wins, right? So I think they were about right for most people's sort of expectations on the football team. I think the things that were really surprising to the team in the season was how good their running game was. Like, they were one of the best rushing teams in the league. I think they finished like top 2 or top 3 in certain categories there. And they were able to really ride that pretty consistently throughout the season to sort of facilitate their offense. I think the quarterback play was a question mark. The defense was a question mark, although they did get better over the course of the season. You can also make the argument that the quarterback play did get better over the course of the season, especially when you compare, Desmond Ritter's play down the stretch and Marcus Mariota's play down the stretch. I see you smiling, Jaden. With that's probably a whole separate podcast talking about that. But, I think if I look at some of the disappointments, I think, maybe the defense didn't show as much growth as I think a lot of people thought they could or would this year. But again, like, you can kind of split the season in half and look at certain metrics. Like in the second half of the season, at least from a points allowed standpoint, they were like the 10th best offense in the league over the last 9 games of the season, or 10th best defense, I'm sorry, in terms of points given up. Now, I don't think that tells the full story of the defense. They didn't look like a top 10 defense. I don't think anybody would be watching the game thinking that they were a top 10 defense, but it does at least point to the fact that the defense was better in the second half and looking, I think, more like a competent defense that I think a lot of people went into the season expecting them to have. And then I would argue probably the biggest other disappointment was Kyle Pitts. That I think a lot of us thought Kyle Pitts would have this monster year coming off of the rookie season that he had a year ago. And I don't think Kyle Pitts having a disappointing year is really his fault, because again, it goes back to that quarterback situation. And I think a lot of that was on, just him and Marcus Mariota just never seemed like they were ever on the same page at any point during the 11 games that Kyle Pitts was healthy before he got injured. But that, I think, was something that I think most people went into the season expecting, okay, this is going to be Kyle Pitts. He already had kind of a breakout year with his rookie season. And this is going to be the year where he sort of puts himself on the map as one of the top talents and top, pass catchers in the NFL. And, we basically spent 2-3 months complaining about why isn't Kyle Pitts getting the football? At least I know a lot of people that play fantasy football were complaining about that. So I think it was an up and down season, but I think there were signs of significant progress for this football team. I think they look like a much more well-coached football team in 2022 than they were in 2021. And a lot of that is due to the progress that they showed from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, some improvements in some of those areas, like the running game that we're talking about. The offensive line got better. The defense got better. So I think there are signs of promising signs of this team is moving in the right direction, where they're an ascending team. Maybe they're not ascending at the rate and at the level that I think a lot of people want them to be in being that sort of playoff caliber team. But I do certainly think that where they are today is a much better place than where they were entering the season.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, man. I think that it's improvement that they made throughout the course of the season. It was important. And again, we talked before we got on, like they were in a point almost where they were contending for the playoffs for a couple of weeks there. Until they entered a little skid. But overall, and we mentioned Marcus Mariota. They bring him in, and I didn't have super high expectations for him in the offense, because of who he is as a player. But I thought it would bring a different dynamic to the offense that we did not have previously with Matt Ryan under center with his legs. And you saw that he was able to use his legs a lot, and it did help this offense out. However, when it came down to the passing mechanics, what was the biggest flaw that you saw from Marcus Mariota throughout the season? Why maybe he wasn't on page with some of his receivers?
Yeah, I think when you look back at what Mariota was in Tennessee, he was always kind of I guess you could say like a quarterback that played off a feel, right? He was always more of a guy that like could, make some great plays, but like in terms of being that sort of precise rhythm, timing passer. And I know for Falcon fans, we had gotten very comfortable with that type of quarterback with Matt Ryan for a decade and a half here of the guy that's going to go to the right spot on time to the right place. You didn't have to worry about like the decision making or anything like that. You were always more worried about all the other pieces around Matt Ryan that could throw off that timing and that rhythm, the offensive line, where the receiver's getting open. Is he put in situations to be successful given some of the concerns with the running game, all those various things? That was never an issue with Matt Ryan, and that became an issue, I think, with Marcus Mariota, where like you could never really run sort of the quick passing game. Like if you were worried about your offensive line, with Matt Ryan, you could basically say, okay, we can do 3-step drops, get the ball out, he's going to go to the right place. That's not something that Marcus Mariota was ever really great at doing in Tennessee, and wasn't really great at doing in Atlanta. Now, to his credit, I think he did get better over the course of the season at operating that type of offense, but it was never going to be sort of the strength of the Falcons offense. He's much more of that type of quarterback that I think he's going to drop back. If the guys are open, he can make, some of those throws. And if they're not open, then he'll, run around and make some extend plays with his legs, and maybe he'll make a play or the. It's kind of, the term I often use was the roller coaster, the Mariota coaster. Like it's up, it's down. Like you live with the downs as long as you get the ups, right? And that's kind of where it balances out. And I think the issue with Mariota was we weren't getting as much ups this season as I think, at least for me, similar to you. I did not have high expectations that he was going to come in and light up the world or anything. I thought he was going to be an inconsistent quarterback, but I thought some of the downs, some of the lows in his play would be balanced out by some of the highs, because he would be able to make some of the plays that we didn't see Matt Ryan make, which is, running around and heaving up a 40-yard bomb to Drake London or Kyle Pitts or something like that. And those were just plays that were not part of the Falcons' repertoire for many, many years. And like you were hoping to get more of that from Mariota. We didn't quite get that. And so I think ultimately, when you're just sort of consistently, in the downs and the lulls of the coaster, that led to the Falcons looking to see, okay, can we get another guy in here that can at least raise the floor? We might not still get the highs that we want in the passing game, but at least we may not have to live in the sort of the downs and the lulls of that roller coaster. And I think, to a certain extent, Desmond Ridder eventually was able to accomplish that, although the Falcons had to go, a little bit through their own ups and downs with him in those early starts for him. Before we start to see a little bit more of that. But it was still a little bit of a roller coaster with Desmond Ridder with some of the slow starts he got off to. But fortunately for us, we saw him finish games relatively stronger than he started, which was not always the case with Mariota.
Yeah, definitely. And so Marcus Mariota finished your 2,219 yards passing, 15 touchdowns, 9 picks, 88.2 rating. I mean,
it's fine.
That's kind of right where I expected.
Yes, it's fine.
You can't expect anything more. So Falcons, of course, finished 7-10. But you mentioned the rushing attack earlier, and how big it was. I mean, because Aaron, just as well as I, over the last couple of years, the running game has not been a strong suit for the Falcons. It's been a pain. But this year, man, huge jump. So what was the difference in that? I mean, because think about last year, they were, I think it was a bottom rushing attack, and now they're top three, top five this year. So what was the key part into making that jump for the Falcons there?
Yeah, I think they were like bottom three, like 30th or something like that last year in terms of rushing attack. So it is literally night and day difference. I think the biggest things I would attribute it to is you just saw improvement from pretty much everybody involved in the running game, right? Cordero Patterson looked better. The blocking is certainly up front. A lot of the credit goes to the offensive line because the truth of the matter is, regardless of who was the running back in the backfield, the Falcons were able to consistently get production out of all three of their running backs, whether it was Patterson, whether it was Algier, whether it was Huntley. And really the only difference between those three guys was just sort of who had the hot hand. Like at the beginning of the season, it was Patterson, then he got hurt, and then it seemed like it was kind of Huntley for the next month or so that Patterson was out of the lineup. And then the minute Patterson came back, it just basically became the Tyler Algier show in the second half of the season. And it just didn't really matter who was carrying the football. The Falcons were able to have an effective running game when all three of those guys were in the backfield this season. And I think that is truly a testament to the blocking up front, the five guys up front. I think another player that's underrated in terms of his contribution as a blocker was Parker Hesse, the tight end, that when you play sort of the Falcons outside zone blocking scheme, you kind of need those tight ends on the outside to really sort of, manage their blocks to sort of seal those edges. Hesse was an improvement there. I think Kyle Pitts, we expected him to be this big time pass catcher, but I think he did contribute as a run blocker. Michael Pruitt was also a valuable contributor in the blocking game. But I think the bulk of the credit has to go to Dwayne Ledford, the Falcons offensive line coach, who did an outstanding job, I think, just getting more out of the talent that he had this year than he did a year ago. You saw pretty much improvement across the board for every single player on the Falcons offensive line. Like Jake Matthews for many years had been a great pass protector, but a terrible run blocker. This year he had one of the best run blocking seasons he's ever had. Chris Lindstrom was one of the best guards in the NFL, went to his first Pro Bowl, potential all-pro candidate. Caleb McGarry was a player that was, people were ready to run him out of town at the end of last year. And then basically turned in, depending on how much stock you put in PFF grades, but he basically was a top 3 run blocker alongside Chris Lindstrom and Trent Williams, who, was basically, the best player in the NFL last year from a blocking standpoint. So that's a testament to his improvement. Drew Dahlman, an inexperienced center, turned into a solid player. Again, he was up and down a little bit, but, I think, certainly people can make arguments either way. I've seen all of them, but I feel like he was better than Matt Hennessy this past year compared to what Hennessy was the previous year. There were some snapping issues, but I think as a run blocker, I think Dahlman really, brought a lot to the table. And then the left guard position where the Falcons just kind of had a revolving door. Jalen Mayfield, was not very good last year. That's the kindest way I can put it. And the Falcons brought in some journeyman players in Elijah Wilkinson. And, he wasn't incredible by any means, but he was very solid. He got hurt for several weeks, and they basically had Matt Hennessy, a player that when he had previous snaps at guard really was problematic. Didn't really skip a beat there. Chuma Edoga getting his real first action at left guard for a game or two was fine there. Kobe Gossett was kind of a practice squad player. He started a couple of games. He was fine there. So I think all of that is a testament to how great a job Dwayne Ledford did from a coaching standpoint. And then, of course, you got to give some credit to Arthur Smith calling the plays. I think he was a little bit more variable in his approach to the run game and not basically running the same 3 or 4 plays like he did, I think, a lot last year, just mixing in some different looks for teams. But at the end of the day, running the football is really about guys going out there and executing their blocks, hitting the holes, getting a hat on a hat. And I think that a lot of that is owed to what Dwayne Ledford was able to do as a coach.
Yeah. And he did a great job coaching that unit. As you mentioned, Jake Matthews, not a very good run blocker last year, but he improved in that aspect this year. And you mentioned Drew Dahlman, of course. I'm glad that you mentioned the snapping issue because I felt like that was a little bit of a problem there throughout the season in different spurts. You got to get those snaps down because they were a little high. Those can turn into issues. Luckily Mariota was able to grab most of them, maybe except for one or two. But that's something I think that he needs to continue to work on throughout the offseason, just getting those snaps down. But yeah, man, I think the offense. I mean, they look good. Better. Drake London had a great season. How would you grade out his year?
Yeah, I think Drake London had a solid rookie season. I had some concerns about Drake London coming into the season just because I was wondering how he would handle the physicality of NFL corners versus some of the corners he was facing in the Pac-12, where he wasn't necessarily facing like the who's who of great NFL talent. And I thought he handled that very well. So that pretty quickly, week one going up against Marshawn Lattimore with the Saints, probably one of the most physical corners in the league. Didn't really have a problem with that. And so he kind of checked that box. Started out the season pretty strong and then kind of faded. And I think, Drake London's rise and fall was kind of attached to Mariota's kind of rise and fall. And like, it just seemed like as the season kept progressing, like him and Mario, rather than sort of getting on the same page, they kind of just felt like they were drifting apart. And then with the insertion of Desmond Ridder in the lineup, after the bye week in week 14, it just basically became the Drake London show. And basically Desmond Ridder was like, Drake's down there somewhere, I'm going to throw it to him. It doesn't matter, if he's covered or nothing, I'm throwing the ball to Drake London as much as possible. He's our go-to guy, especially in light of Kyle Pitts being out for the season. So the offense kind of just ran through Drake London, the passing game especially. And so I think Drake London really stepped up in a major way. The only real concern I had with Drake London was just a couple of those fumbles. It was just like just ball security, like that was it. And the problem with Drake London was not the fact that he was fumbling, because everybody fumbles, but it was just the situations that he did fumble, like fourth down conversions in critical moments. Like those are the worst times for you to fumble the football. And so it just, whether you want to call it bad luck or, maybe not necessarily, having his head in the game or whatever, it just seemed like, once it happens, okay, bad luck, whatever. It happens a second time, you're like, wait a second, like what's going on here? So that's really the only knock I have on Drake London, his performance. I think he's turning into a very good NFL receiver. There's going to be a lot of debate, in the coming years over, is he a number one? Is he a number two? We'll sort of see where he falls on that. But I think he certainly showed enough flashes where you feel, if you do believe that he has the ability to be a number one, he showed enough there. And if he's just a number two, then I think he's going to be one of the better number twos in the NFL. So I feel really good at where Drake London is at this point, 1 year into his NFL career.
Yeah, I do agree. He's had a great year, aside from the turnovers, of course. But he's a great presence in the red zone as well, which I hope the Falcons look to exploit more, continuously over the next couple of years or so. So especially with Ridder there at quarterback. So that's what I'm looking forward to as well. Moving to the defensive side of football, where it's always a fun conversation. We talk about the Falcons defense. Now you said they've improved over the course of the year. They improved. They've gotten better. The pass rush still not there, but we saw improvement. So, what are your overall takes on the Falcons defense this year, and what needs to happen moving forward to improve?
Yeah, the pass rush was still bottom of the league. It was technically better than it was last year. They went from 32 to 31, I think, in sacks this year. So that is better, right? They got a few more sacks this year than they did last year. That was disappointing. I think we were, I think a lot of us, myself included, were hoping that they would, break 30 sacks this year. They were not able to. I think they wind up with like 22 or something like that this year. So that is something that definitely needs to continue to be improved upon and invested in. And I certainly think the Falcons will do something this offseason. I was going to say do your best, but knowing the Falcons, they don't always do their best when it comes to investing in their pass rush. But I think the bright sides of the Falcons defense and where they were successful was playing a bend but don't break style of defense. And it was like they were going to give up a ton of yards. Teams were going to go on these 10, 12 play drives, these long drives, convert a bunch of third downs. They were bottom 3 in the NFL in terms of third down efficiency. But where they were able to consistently get stops was in the red zone. And, for most of the season, that strategy worked for them because for most of the season, their offense was a top 10 red zone offense. And they were also, after the first 2 or 3 games, a top 10 red zone defense. And so if the opposing team is settling for 3 points in the red zone and the Falcons are scoring 7, that was a formula that led to them, getting off to the start that they were able to get off to this season, where we were talking about them going into November as a playoff team. So I think that's a positive sign for the team. They were able at times to create some turnovers there that also I think benefited the defense a little bit. So I think there are positive signs. You saw, Grady Jarrett's still a good player. You saw some positive things from not Arnold Ebiketie, the other Nigerian guy. Arnold Ebiketie, you saw some positive things for him. The secondary, I think probably we went into the season thinking the secondary would be the strength of the defense. It was, although it probably wasn't as consistently strong as I think a lot of us expected it to be. Just early in the season, you had AJ Terrell getting off to a little bit of a slow start the first couple of games, but then kind of figured it out at that point in time. Casey Hayward getting off to a similar slow start. Then he got hurt around the time when he started playing well, and then the Falcons were kind of forced to have to deal with playing with his backups, and that was an issue. But I think even though Darren Hall and Cornell Armstrong were certainly not starting caliber corners, I think they did an admirable job given what they were expected to do. D. Alford had a good year. Isaiah Oliver had a good year. Richie Grant showed that he could be a playmaker, a little bit up and down. The highs were good. The lows were not so great. And so I think there are positive things to build from the secondary. The linebacker core, was okay at the beginning of the season. I think as the season wore on, you started to see more of their limitations, missed tackles, blown coverages, those sorts of things. So I think that's, in addition to the pass rush, is going to be something that the Falcons are going to have to continue to shore up. But I think, we know that the Falcons only have a handful of really good players on defense. It's AJ Terrell, it's Grady Jarrett. You're hoping that Arnold Ebiketie can join that group. But I think there were enough positive signs that, the Richie Grants and the D. Alfords and Isaiah Olivers show that they can be very valuable role players on a good defense. And it's just a question of, can the Falcons add a few more pieces on that side of the ball? Obviously it all starts up front with, getting more pressure on the quarterback.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that linebacking core, and it was a position where the Falcons, like you said, they struggle a little bit in the pass coverage there. A lot of, the middle of the field has always been, for the last couple of years, been a struggle point for the Falcons to cover for some specific reason. That's really where I noticed a lot of the big plays happen over the middle of the field. So that's something I definitely think they need to work on. Now, Rashaan Evans, he had a solid year. I'll give him that. He had a solid year. Just not the best in coverage. But he had a solid year. And how do you think, as far as Troy Anderson, as a rookie, how would you grade out his season? How he did filling in?
Yeah, Troy Anderson's interesting because I went into the season having no expectations for him. I was like, he's this raw. He only played 2 years at Montana State. There was some concerns about, is he physical enough to handle the NFL game? And we saw last year with Deion Jones and Foye Oluokun and with Michael Walker sort of being their primary backup, he saw the field in certain situations, but he was not playing more than maybe 5 to 10 snaps a game last year. And so I kind of envisioned Troy Anderson in that similar role where it's okay, he goes out there and gets a couple of snaps here or there. He can handle that, but he's probably not expected to do more than that. And then we saw pretty early in the season, I think it was starting in that Seattle game in week 3, that the Falcons were ready to give him a lot more opportunities than that. And I think it paid off in certain ways because they did have some injuries there and they were forced to start Troy Anderson midway through the season. And then, after the bye week, he really essentially became the starter, supplanting Michael Walker in that role next to Rashaan Evans. And while I don't think Troy Anderson did great work as a starter, I will say that I think he came in above my expectations. I don't think the physicality of the league was an issue for him. It was just more like, oh, he's young, he's not great when it comes to like getting proper leverage against blocks. He'll still blow a coverage every now and then, just out of youth and inexperience and those types of things. But things that you feel pretty promising that, like, okay, with time, with development, those things can improve. Like the mental errors you can fix, the physical deficiencies is really hard to fix in the NFL. And I was much more worried going into the season about some of the physical deficiencies that he may have. And that proved to be mostly a non-issue for him. And so that gives me at least a lot more optimism that whatever issues he was dealing with this year and the ups and downs, that those are areas that with time can go away. So I still have hope and optimism for Troy Anderson, but I certainly think, he clearly still is a project. We kind of knew that's what he was going to be coming into the NFL, but I think there are reasons to be more optimistic that, maybe he's not as big a project as people like myself thought he might be.
Yeah, definitely. And Dean Pease, of course, retiring as a defensive coordinator, so that's going to be a role that the Falcons are going to have to fill, along with many others along the team. So, are you hearing anything as far as about what, I know it's still early. I mean, like, we're not even in the playoffs yet, but as far as who they could possibly go after for that role, you hear anything about that?
I haven't heard anything other than probably the rumor that other people have heard, which is like they're looking at Jim Haslett just because he has like a connection between all the people in the building. Like he coached in Tennessee with Dean Pease and Arthur Smith. He was also in Washington where Kyle Smith, who's the Falcons assistant GM, and he was, of course, in New Orleans many, many years ago, where Terry Fontenot was. So, like, he has connections to all these coaches. He's been, I'm trying to think, was he with Tennessee last year or was he with somebody else? Oh, no, he's in the XFL now. That's what it was. But he was with Tennessee recently. So he's the only name I've heard. I think we'll probably hear a couple more names over the next week or two. It sounds like they'll probably, they're not going to rush out and make a hire in the next couple of days. They'll probably interview a couple of people, and this may take a week or two. But I certainly think probably by the time we get to February, we'll know who the new defensive coordinator is, due to the fact that they will be going to Las Vegas for the Shrine Bowl, and I would imagine they would like to have their defensive coordinator hired by that point in time, so that they can do their full development there for that week of practice at the Shrine Bowl. So I haven't heard anything other than Jim Haslett as a potential option, but I'm sure over the next couple of days we'll hear a couple of other names thrown into the ring. I don't necessarily have a horse in the race in terms of who I would like to see. Jim Haslett probably isn't the most inspiring hire, if that would prove to be who the Falcons went with. So I'll be curious to see sort of who else is on that short list, and if maybe they're a little bit more of a person that you can get excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on over the next couple weeks or so. And as you mentioned, the Falcons coaching staff will be coaching in that East and West Shrine Bowl, which is pretty interesting news there to hear. So, but yeah, Aaron. Other than that, man, it's been once again eventful Falcons season, as we always have here in Atlanta. So, looking forward to 2023 and what it holds in store for us. But thanks again for coming on the podcast, man. We'll definitely have you back on soon to as we get closer and closer to the draft and free agency opening up. So a lot of things to talk about there. But for now, thank you for joining us here on the Jays With Now podcast, Aaron.
Really appreciate you having me, Jay.
Of course, man. You have a good one, all right?
All right, you too.
Thank you.